The late August heat in Atlanta was oppressive, the kind of heavy, suffocating warmth that clung to the skin and blurred the horizon. But inside the cavernous, stained-glass sanctuary of Mount Zion Cathedral, the air was chilled to a crisp, artificial perfection. It was a fitting temperature for the farewell of Marcus Vance, a man who had ruled Atlanta's luxury real estate empire with the same cold, calculating precision. In the first pew, separated by a deliberate, agonizing foot of space from the rest of the family, sat Eleanor Vance. At 65, Eleanor possessed a beauty that time had not diminished, but rather distilled into something formidable. She was dressed in a tailored, jet-black St. John knit suit, her posture as rigid and straight as the mahogany pews. A wide-brimmed mourning hat cast a veil of fine black netting over the upper half of her face, obscuring her eyes but highlighting the sharp, dignified cut of her cheekbones and the tight line of her mouth. She wore a single strand of South Sea pearls, a gift from Marcus on their 20th anniversary. They rested heavy against her collarbone, feeling more like a chain today than a tribute. For 40 years, Eleanor had been the quiet force behind the Titan. She had been the woman who remembered the birthdays of ruthless city councilmen, the hostess who smoothed over Marcus's abrasive edges at elite Buckhead charity galas, and the only person who knew the terrifying depth of his night terrors. She had loved a difficult man, absorbing his shadows so he could shine under the spotlights. And now, as she looked at the closed bronze casket draped in a blanket of pristine white orchids, she felt a profound, hollow stillness. He was gone. The man who had promised to protect her from the world, and from his own blood, was reduced to a memory and a monument. A rustle of expensive silk and the heavy scent of Tom Ford cologne shattered her quiet morning. The Vance children had arrived to take their places in the pew beside her. Eleanor didn't turn her head, but she felt the shift in the air. The temperature in the church seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Desmond Vance, the eldest at 42, sat closest to the invisible boundary line dividing the pew. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor could see him adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. He looked the part of the grieving heir, his jaw set in a mask of solemn responsibility. But Eleanor, who had spent decades observing the microscopic tails of liars, noticed the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the air conditioning. She noticed how his thumb rhythmically, obsessively tapped against his thigh, and how his eyes constantly darted toward the church entrance. Desmond was a man drowning. His venture capital firm had been bleeding money for 3 years, a fact he desperately tried to hide behind leased sports cars and a forced smile. He wasn't mourning his father. He was waiting for the bank vault to unlock. Beside him sat Sienna Vance Carter, 38, dressed in a black velvet Alexander McQueen dress that dipped slightly too low for a funeral, but photographed exceptionally well. Sienna had spent the last 20 minutes in the vestibule ensuring the society photographers from Atlanta Elite magazine captured her brave, tearful arrival. Now, safely inside, her eyes were completely dry. She held a lace handkerchief, delicately dabbing at her makeup so as not to ruin her contouring. Sienna had always viewed Eleanor not as a stepmother, but as the hired help who had overstayed her welcome, a woman of common working-class roots who had somehow tricked her way into an empire. At the end of the row slouched Trey, the youngest at 35. He smelled faintly of peppermint breath mints and aged bourbon, a desperate attempt to mask the hangover from the night before. Trey was the family's open secret, perpetually floating between consulting jobs within Marcus's empire, skimming just enough off the top of the charitable foundation to fund his habits. He kept checking his platinum Rolex, clearly agitated, wondering how long he had to sit through the eulogies before the reading of the will. As the choir's voices swelled, filling the vaulted ceilings with a haunting rendition of Amazing Grace, Eleanor felt the collective gaze of Atlanta's black elite pressing into her back. The sanctuary was packed with mayors, senators, real estate moguls, and generational wealth, and Eleanor knew exactly what they were whispering. There she is, the second wife, the former assistant. Marcus left everything to the kids, didn't he? She's about to be tossed out of Buckhead by Friday. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the white orchids. She had survived 40 years of their whispers. She had endured the thinly veiled insults at country club luncheons, the patronizing pats on the arm from Sienna, the blatant disrespect from Desmond. She had swallowed her pride 1,000 times over because Marcus had asked her to. Just let them have their pride, Elle, he would whisper to her in the dark of their bedroom, stroking her hair. They have my name, but you have my soul. Let them play their games. But Marcus was no longer here to ask for her patience. The pastor, a towering man with a booming baritone, took the pulpit. Today we gather to celebrate a titan. Marcus Vance built more than skyscrapers. He built a legacy. He was a visionary, a provider, a father who wanted nothing but the world for his children. Eleanor closed her eyes behind her veil. A legacy. Marcus loved his children out of a primal sense of duty, but he harbored no illusions about who they were. He knew Desmond was a fraud, Sienna was shallow, and Trey was a thief. Yet in his final months, as his heart began to fail, Marcus had grown strangely quiet about his estate. He had locked Eleanor out of the meetings with his team of ruthless corporate lawyers. When she had asked him about her security, he had simply looked at her with an expression she couldn't decode, a mix of deep sorrow and cold calculation. The 2-hour service dragged on, a parade of politicians and business partners painting a portrait of a saint that Eleanor barely recognized. When it was finally over, the family stood. Desmond turned to Eleanor, his voice dripping with forced, hollow courtesy for the benefit of the onlookers. "Eleanor, we'll be hosting the reception at the main house. You're welcome to ride in the second town car." The main house. It had been Eleanor's home for 4 decades. She had picked out the imported marble in the foyer, planted the hydrangeas lining the driveway, and meticulously curated the art collection. Yet Desmond spoke as if she were a distant, slightly bothersome cousin being granted a favor. "I will drive myself, Desmond," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but carrying a resonance that made him blink. It was smooth, dark, and unyielding, like polished obsidian. "I'll see you at the estate." Sienna scoffed quietly, linking her arm through Desmond's. "Suit yourself. Just don't be late. The caterers need direction, and you're so good at managing the staff." It was a deliberate, stinging reminder of Eleanor's past as an assistant. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply nodded, adjusting her veil. "I always make sure everything is exactly where it belongs, Sienna." 3 hours later, the Vance estate in Buckhead was swarming with guests. The sprawling 3-story brick Georgian mansion buzzed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of networking masked as condolences. Eleanor stood near the grand staircase, a silent observer in her own home. She watched as Desmond held court in Marcus's mahogany-paneled study, pouring his father's $500 Macallan Scotch for potential investors, already acting as the reigning king. She watched Sienna posing near the grand piano, accepting sympathies while simultaneously criticizing the floral arrangements to her friends. They were vultures, circling a carcass they believed was already theirs. They moved with the arrogant certainty of people who had never known the word no. They believed that tomorrow morning, at the offices of Sterling and Vance Law, they would be crowned royalty, and the help would finally be dismissed. Eleanor turned her gaze to a large, oil-painted portrait of Marcus hanging above the fireplace. His painted eyes seemed to follow her, holding that same enigmatic, secretive glint he had in his final days. A quiet, terrifying calm settled over Eleanor's heart. She didn't know what tomorrow's reading of the will would bring. She didn't know how deep Marcus's betrayal might run, or if he had truly left her to the mercy of these wolves. But as she watched Trey sneak a silver cigarette case into his jacket pocket, stealing from his own dead father's desk, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would not break. Whatever humiliation they planned for her, whatever scraps they intended to throw her way, she would take them with her head held high. She had walked into this family with nothing but her dignity, and if she had to leave tomorrow, she would take every ounce of it with her. The stage was set. The audience was seated. The Vance children thought they had already won the war, completely unaware that the real battle hadn't even begun. The law offices of Sterling, Vance, and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a shimmering glass high-rise in Midtown Atlanta. The boardroom on the 42nd floor offered a panoramic, commanding view of the city skyline, a visual reminder to everyone who entered of exactly how much power Marcus Vance had wielded. At 10 a.m. sharp on a Tuesday, the room was thick with a silence so dense it felt suffocating. Eleanor sat at the far end of the sprawling, polished mahogany table. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, her posture impeccable, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Across from her sat the Vance children. They had abandoned the somber black of the funeral. Desmond wore a crisp navy pinstripe suit, his leg bouncing with nervous, predatory energy. Sienna was draped in an emerald green silk blouse, idly checking her diamond-studded Cartier watch. Trey slouched in his leather chair, nursing a cup of black coffee, his eyes bloodshot but wide awake. At the head of the table sat Arthur Sterling, Marcus's oldest friend and the senior partner of the firm. Arthur was a silver-haired, distinguished man who had always treated Eleanor with genuine respect. But today, Arthur looked physically ill. He shuffled the thick stack of cream-colored, watermarked parchment before him, unable to meet Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you all for being here," Arthur began, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority. He cleared his throat. "I want to preface this by stating that Marcus was of exceptionally sound mind when he drafted this final iteration of his will 6 months ago. The language is explicit. He insisted on drafting certain clauses himself." Desmond leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Let's just get to it, Arthur. The market opens in an hour, and we have the transition of the board to manage." Arthur adjusted his reading glasses. "Very well. I will skip the boilerplate legalities and move directly to the division of the primary estate." For the next 20 minutes, Arthur read off a staggering inventory of wealth. Desmond was granted the controlling voting shares of Vance Holdings and a commercial real estate portfolio valued at $40 million. Sienna was awarded the liquid investment accounts, an offshore trust, and the deed to a luxury condo in Paris. Trey, to his visible relief, received a multi-million-dollar discretionary trust fund. With every asset distributed, the air in the room shifted. The Vance children sat taller, their expressions shifting from anticipation to blatant, intoxicating vindication. They exchanged knowing, triumphant glances. They were finally out from under their father's shadow, holding the keys to the kingdom. Eleanor remained perfectly still. She didn't care about the company shares or the Paris condo. She cared about her home. She cared about the security Marcus had sworn to her under the darkness of countless nights. Arthur stopped reading. The boardroom fell dead silent. He took a slow, labored breath, finally looking down the length of the table at Eleanor. The profound sorrow in his eyes made Eleanor's chest tighten. "Now," Arthur said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "To the matter of the primary residence in Buckhead and the provisions for Eleanor Vance." Sienna stopped checking her watch. Desmond stopped bouncing his leg. They leaned in, smelling blood. "I am required by law to read this verbatim," Arthur said apologetically. He looked down at the paper. "To my wife, Eleanor Vance. For 40 years you have resided in my home, enjoyed the unparalleled fruits of my labor, and lived a lifestyle of extreme privilege that far exceeded your original station in life." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow to the sternum. Original station in life. He was reminding everyone that she had been his assistant. He was reducing 4 decades of devotion, sacrifice, and love to a transactional ledger. Arthur swallowed hard, continuing, "I believe that you have been more than adequately compensated for your companionship and your management of my domestic affairs. Therefore, it is my final decree that the primary estate in Buckhead is to be transferred immediately to my biological daughter, Sienna Vance Carter." Sienna let out a sharp, breathless gasp of delight, covering her mouth in mock surprise. "Furthermore," Arthur read, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "Eleanor is to vacate the Buckhead premises no later than 30 days from the reading of this will. She is entitled to her personal clothing and the jewelry gifted during our marriage. She is not to remove any furniture, art, or fixtures. As her final bequest, I leave her the remainder of my undocumented personal effects, contained within the wooden box held by my attorney." The silence that followed was deafening, erased. After 40 years, Eleanor was not just disinherited. She was erased, dismissed like a maid whose contract had expired. No pension, no savings, no home. At 65 years old, she was being thrown out onto the street with 30 days' notice. Desmond couldn't contain a short, barking laugh. He ran a hand over his face, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "I'll be damned. The old man actually did it." He finally woke up. Sienna turned to Eleanor, her eyes glittering with undisguised malice. Her voice was dripping with false, sugary sympathy. "Well, Eleanor, I suppose 30 days is generous. It will give you time to find a nice, modest apartment. Maybe back in your old neighborhood in Decatur. I'll even have one of the movers pack your clothes for you." Trey snickered, leaning back in his chair. "Better start looking today, Elle. Rents are high these days." Eleanor felt the world tilting on its axis. The betrayal was so absolute, so cruelly public, that it momentarily robbed her of breath. The man she had loved, the man who had whispered that she was the only pure thing in his life, had publicly stripped her naked for his children to mock. She felt the sudden, burning prickle of tears threatening to spill from her eyes. No. Eleanor dug her manicured nails into the palms of her hands under the table until the physical pain grounded her. Do not give them your tears. Do not let them see you bleed. She summoned every ounce of the formidable grace she had cultivated over 40 years. She slowly smoothed the skirt of her suit, her expression hardening into a mask of flawless, impenetrable porcelain. Arthur Sterling reached under the conference table and produced a box. It wasn't an ornate, velvet-lined case. It was a dull, scuffed cedar cigar box. He slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Eleanor. "This is it, Eleanor," Arthur said quietly. I am so deeply sorry." Eleanor looked at the box. The Vance children watched her, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the screaming match, waiting for her to beg. Instead, Eleanor reached out with steady hands and opened the brass latch. Inside rested a single, heavy, rusted iron key. Beneath it was a piece of thick, yellowed cardstock. Written in Marcus's unmistakable sharp handwriting was a single line: 42 Ocean Park, Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts. No explanation, no context. Just a key to an unknown door in Martha's Vineyard, an island she had never visited, 1,000 miles away from everything she knew. Sienna scoffed, craning her neck to see inside. A rusty key? What is that, to a storage unit? A safety deposit box full of his old love letters? She laughed, a high, grating sound. You have 30 days, Eleanor. I have contractors coming on day 31 to tear out that hideous marble you put in the foyer. Don't be there when they arrive. Eleanor slowly closed the lid of the cedar box. She picked it up, her fingers gripping the rough wood. She stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She looked at Trey, then at Sienna, and finally rested her cold, dark gaze on Desmond. "Enjoy your inheritance, Desmond," Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm, resonating with a quiet authority that instantly silenced their laughter. "I hope it brings you exactly the peace you deserve." She turned to the lawyer. "Thank you, Arthur. Good day." Without another word, without a single tear, Eleanor Vance turned her back on the boardroom, the skyline, and the millions of dollars. She walked out of the glass doors, her heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the marble floor. She had 30 days to pack up 40 years of her life. She had 30 days to survive living in a house with monsters. But as she rode the elevator down to the lobby, clutching the cedar box to her chest, the shock began to recede, replaced by a deep, simmering ember of survival. Marcus had betrayed her, yes, but Marcus never did anything without a reason, and as long as she had breath in her lungs, she was going to find out why. The 30 days that followed the reading of the will were a masterclass in psychological warfare. For Eleanor Vance, the sprawling Buckhead estate, a home she had breathed life, warmth, and culture into for 4 decades, transformed overnight into an occupied territory. The indignities began on day 3. Eleanor was in the formal living room, quietly wrapping a collection of first-edition books in acid-free tissue paper. The heavy oak double doors swung open, and Sienna swept in, flanked by a flamboyant, clipboard-wielding interior designer. Sienna didn't even glance at Eleanor. She moved through the room as if her stepmother were merely a piece of outdated furniture waiting to be hauled away to the dump. "The mahogany has to go, Julian," Sienna declared, waving a manicured hand dismissively at the custom-built bookshelves Eleanor had commissioned in 1992. "It's giving oppressive old-money suffocation. I want everything gutted. White marble, minimalist. Oh, and this art?" Sienna pointed to a stunning original Romary Bearden collage that Marcus and Eleanor had purchased together in New York. "Put it in storage, or auction it. It doesn't fit my aesthetic." Eleanor's hands paused over a leather-bound volume of Toni Morrison. The Bearden piece was museum quality, a celebration of Black resilience and jazz-age vibrancy. To Sienna, it was just clutter. Eleanor carefully placed the book in her cardboard box, keeping her breathing perfectly measured. Let them have their sterile white walls, she thought. They have no warmth in their souls to fill them anyway. By day 12, Desmond had essentially moved into the east wing of the house, despite having his own mansion across town. He treated the estate like a luxury hotel, barking orders at the skeletal staff that hadn't yet been dismissed. One afternoon, while carrying a stack of folded sweaters down the hall, Eleanor inadvertently glanced into the open door of Marcus's old study. Desmond was pacing behind the heavy desk, his tie undone, the phone pressed hard against his ear. His voice was a panicked, hushed hiss. "I don't care what the margin call is. You tell them Vance Holdings is rock solid." "No, you cannot liquidate those assets. My father's estate is still in probate. Give me 30 days. Just give me 30 days. Eleanor kept walking, her face an unreadable mask, but her mind was sharp. He's drowning, she realized. Desmond wasn't the triumphant heir he pretended to be. He was a desperate man standing on a trap door, waiting for the rope to snap. Trey was perhaps the most pathetic of the three. On day 20, Eleanor caught him in the formal dining room, slipping 2 antique silver serving spoons from the velvet-lined credenza into his jacket pocket. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he froze like a deer in headlights. "Taking souvenirs, Trey?" Eleanor asked, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. Trey flushed a deep, angry red, puffing out his chest to overcompensate for his embarrassment. "It's my house now, Eleanor. I can take whatever the hell I want. You should focus on packing your cheap clothes instead of policing my property." "Those spoons belong to your grandmother," Eleanor replied softly, her dark eyes piercing right through his bravado. "She polished them every Sunday. It's a shame you'll pawn them for a fraction of what her memory is worth." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, suddenly looking very small in the massive, echoing room. The most agonizing moment, the true test of Eleanor's legendary composure, came on day 28. Behind the mansion lay Eleanor's sanctuary, an expansive, glass-enclosed greenhouse and a meticulously curated rose garden. She had spent decades cultivating rare black baccarat roses, their petals so dark they looked like velvet dipped in Cabernet. It was the only place where she didn't have to be the perfect hostess or the vigilant wife. Here, with her hands in the soil, she was just Eleanor. She stood at the edge of the terrace, a mug of black coffee in her hands, taking in the morning mist rolling over the glass panes. "We'll need bulldozers for the glass structure," Sienna's voice sliced through the tranquil morning air. She was standing on the lawn below with a commercial landscaping crew. "Rip all of this out. The roses, the trellises, all of it. I want a zero-edge infinity pool and a sunken fire pit right here. Make it look like a resort in Tulum." The coffee mug in Eleanor's hand trembled. A hot, violent spike of grief and pure rage flared in her chest. Rip it all out. They weren't just erasing Marcus's will. They were actively, vindictively salting the earth of her existence. They wanted no trace that a woman named Eleanor Vance had ever lived, loved, or planted roots on this soil. She closed her eyes, swallowing the bitter lump in her throat. She would not give Sienna the satisfaction of a tear. She would not beg for the roses. She turned her back on the garden and walked inside. Let them destroy it. You cannot kill roots that have already been transplanted. Finally, the night of day 29 arrived. The mansion was eerily quiet. A heavy, late summer thunderstorm was battering Atlanta, rain lashing fiercely against the tall windows. Eleanor sat on the edge of a bare mattress in a small guest bedroom. The master suite had been locked by Desmond's lawyers weeks ago. Surrounding her were 3 vintage Louis Vuitton steamer trunks, the only luggage she had brought into the marriage 40 years ago, and the only luggage she was taking out. She had packed light. She left behind the diamonds she didn't care for, the designer gowns that felt like costumes, and the hollow socialite armor. On her lap sat the dull cedar cigar box Arthur Sterling had handed her. She opened it again, the brass hinges protesting with a faint squeak. Inside lay the rusted iron key and the yellowed cardstock with the address, 42 Ocean Park, Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts. Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard. It was a place of profound historical significance for affluent Black Americans, a haven where generations had built communities of joy, intellect, and safety away from the mainland's prejudices. But Marcus had never taken her there. They summered in the Hamptons or the south of France. Why Oak Bluffs? Why a rusted key? Eleanor picked up the key. It was heavy, cold, and entirely out of place for a man who demanded everything be polished and new. She looked down at the empty box. Marcus was a man of infinite complexities. He was a chess player who thought 5 moves ahead. He never did anything carelessly. He wouldn't have used a deep cedar box just to hold a single piece of paper and a key. Her brow furrowed. She pressed her thumbs against the green felt lining the bottom of the box. It felt soft, normal. But then she ran her manicured thumbnail along the inner seam where the felt met the cedar wood. There, a microscopic gap. Eleanor's heart began to beat a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dug her nail into the gap and pried upward. With a soft, yielding pop, the false bottom of the box lifted away. Eleanor gasped, the sound swallowed by a crack of thunder outside. Hidden beneath the felt was a heavy, solid silver money clip tarnished with age. Folded beneath the clip was a letter, written on Marcus's personal, thick cotton stationery. And engraved on the silver clip itself were 3 words, Vincit qui patitur, he who endures, conquers. It was the phrase Marcus used to whisper to her when the society wives were particularly cruel, or when the pressures of his empire threatened to crush them both. With trembling hands, Eleanor unfolded the letter. The handwriting was sharp, hurried, but unmistakably his. Mael, if you are reading this, you have survived the 30 days. I know the agony I have put you through. I know the humiliation you endured at the hands of my children. Forgive me, my love, for I had to make it look real. I had to let them believe they had won the war, so they would blind themselves to the trap I have set for them. Desmond, Sienna, and Trey are vultures. If I had left you the estate, they would have tied you up in probate court for a decade. They would have bled you dry with lawyers, contested my sanity, and destroyed your peace. So I gave them exactly what they wanted, an illusion of wealth wrapped in razor wire. Let them celebrate their iron cage. They have inherited a decaying empire of debt, restrictions, and historical preservation laws that will slowly crush them. But you, my queen, I leave you the only thing that actually matters. The key in this box opens the door to 42 Ocean Park. It is not part of my estate. It never was. I bought it 40 years ago, the year we were married, and it has been in your name ever since. It is untouchable. It is yours. Go to the vineyard. Open the door. Inside you will find my true legacy, and the arsenal you need to protect yourself if they ever try to come for you. I loved you in the shadows, Eleanor. Now step into the light. Forever, Marcus. A single tear, hot, heavy, and full of 40 years of vindication, slipped down Eleanor's cheek, splashing onto the heavy cotton paper. She covered her mouth, a breathless, magnificent laugh escaping her lips. It was a laugh of profound shock, of intense relief, and of dangerous awakening. Marcus hadn't erased her. He had shielded her. He had orchestrated the most brilliant, ruthless, legally binding revenge plot in Atlanta's history, and he had used his own death to spring the trap. Eleanor wiped the tear from her cheek. Her posture shifted. The heaviness of the past 30 days evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated power. She wasn't an exiled widow. She was the sole owner of a secret kingdom. The next morning, the sun broke through the storm clouds, washing the Buckhead estate in a crisp, golden light. At 9 a.m. sharp, Eleanor Vance walked down the grand sweeping staircase for the last time. She was dressed not in morning black, but in a striking, immaculate ivory wool trench coat, her hair perfectly coiffed, a vibrant silk Hermes scarf draped elegantly around her neck. She wore dark, oversized sunglasses that hid her eyes, giving her the aura of a movie star leaving a premiere. Desmond and Sienna were waiting in the foyer, flanked by a team of movers they had hired to supervise her departure. They had expected her to look broken, exhausted, and destitute. Instead, Eleanor glided across the marble floor with the confident, lethal grace of a panther. "The keys to the estate are on the console, Desmond," Eleanor said, her voice bright, musical, and completely unbothered. Sienna frowned, completely thrown off balance by Eleanor's radiant aura. "Where are you going, Eleanor? Do you need us to call you a cab to wherever it is you'll be staying?" Eleanor paused at the heavy mahogany front doors. She turned back, looking at the 2 arrogant heirs standing in the foyer of a house that was about to become their financial tomb. A slow, brilliant, entirely predatory smile spread across Eleanor's face. "No, thank you, Sienna," Eleanor purred, sliding her leather-gloved hand over the brass door handle. "I'm going exactly where I belong. Oh, and Desmond, have the roof above the east wing checked. It leaks when it rains, and historical preservation permits take months to clear." Leaving them standing in stunned, confused silence, Eleanor walked out the door, stepped into her vintage Mercedes, and drove away. She didn't look back in the rearview mirror once. She was heading north, toward the ocean, toward Oak Bluffs, and toward a kingdom they knew nothing about. The drive from Atlanta to Woods Hole, Massachusetts, was a grueling 1,000-mile ascension up the eastern seaboard, but to Eleanor Vance, it felt like an exorcism. She drove her vintage 1972 Mercedes-Benz 280SE, a pristine silver-blue masterpiece Marcus had gifted her on their 10th anniversary. The rhythmic, steady hum of the German engine became her heartbeat as she crossed state lines, leaving the oppressive humidity of Georgia behind. With every mile marker that vanished in her rearview mirror, the suffocating weight of the Vance empire seemed to lift from her shoulders. She didn't listen to the radio. The silence inside the leather-lined cabin was a luxury she hadn't afforded herself in decades. In Atlanta, silence was dangerous. It meant someone was plotting. But out here, on the open stretch of Interstate 95, silence was a canvas. She replayed the words of Marcus's hidden letter in her mind 100 times. I had to let them believe they had won the war, so they would blind themselves to the trap I have set for them. He had played the ultimate game of chess, using his own death as the opening gambit. He had weaponized his children's greed against them. But more importantly, he had shielded her. By the time Eleanor drove her Mercedes onto the Steamship Authority ferry at Woods Hole, the air had changed. The thick, sweet southern heat was replaced by the crisp, briny bite of the Atlantic Ocean. Eleanor stood on the upper deck of the ferry, the wind whipping at her ivory silk scarf, watching the coastline of Martha's Vineyard slowly materialize on the horizon. For affluent Black Americans, Martha's Vineyard, and specifically the town of Oak Bluffs, was not just a summer vacation spot. It was hallowed ground. For over a century, it had been a sanctuary for the Black elite, a place where doctors, artists, politicians, and writers could gather, thrive, and simply exist without the suffocating gaze of the mainland. It was a place of deep, unapologetic cultural pride, and Marcus had bought a piece of it. For her. When the ferry docked, Eleanor drove off the ramp and navigated the winding, picturesque roads toward Oak Bluffs. The GPS guided her past the iconic Inkwell Beach and onto the sweeping, manicured crescent of Ocean Park. She pulled up to number 42. Eleanor put the car in park, her hands gripping the ivory steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had expected a modest cottage, perhaps something quaint and secluded. She was entirely unprepared for the majesty of what stood before her. 42 Ocean Park was not a cottage. It was a breathtaking 3-story Queen Anne Victorian estate. It sat proudly on a double lot, boasting a sweeping wraparound veranda, an elegant corner turret, and intricate gingerbread trim painted in tasteful, understated shades of deep navy, slate gray, and crisp white. The lawn was impeccably manicured, bordered by lush, blooming hydrangeas that mirrored the colors of the sea just across the street. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't decaying. It was vibrantly, defiantly alive. Eleanor stepped out of the car, the ocean breeze catching the hem of her trench coat. Her legs felt suddenly heavy, completely unmoored. She walked up the brick pathway, her heels clicking softly, and stepped onto the wide wooden porch. There were plush, navy-cushioned rocking chairs arranged to face the water, as if waiting for a conversation that was about to begin. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out the rusted iron key. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the heavy brass lock of the ornate leaded glass front door. Despite its rusted appearance, the key turned with a smooth, perfectly oiled click. The rust had been a disguise, just another layer of Marcus's brilliant deception to make Sienna and Desmond believe the property was worthless. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was not stale or dusty. It smelled faintly of beeswax, sea salt, and fresh lavender. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass transoms, casting colorful, dancing prisms across immaculate, wide-plank mahogany floors. "Hello?" Eleanor called out, her voice echoing softly in the grand foyer. There was no answer. She was entirely alone. She walked into the main living room, and the breath was instantly knocked from her lungs. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had not shed a single tear when she was disinherited, who had stared down her vicious stepchildren without blinking, finally broke. The house was a shrine. It was not a shrine to Marcus's ego, nor to the Vance real estate empire. It was a shrine to her, to them. The walls were adorned not with the cold, modern, minimalist art Sienna favored, but with museum-quality masterpieces celebrating their heritage. A breathtaking original painting by Jacob Lawrence hung above the stone fireplace. Across the room, a vibrant, sweeping canvas by Alma Thomas commanded the space. The furniture was elegant but inviting. Plush velvet sofas in deep sapphire, antique brass reading lamps, and Persian rugs that tied the room together with warmth. But it was the photographs that brought Eleanor to her knees. Arranged on the mantel, lining the hallways, and resting on the grand piano were dozens of silver-framed photographs. They weren't the stiff-posed society portraits from the Atlanta galas. They were candid, intimate moments captured over 40 years. There was a photo of Eleanor in 1986, laughing with her head thrown back, her hair wild in the wind on a boat. There was a photo of her in 1995, asleep in a wingback chair with a book resting on her chest. There was a picture of her hands, just her hands, kneeling in the dirt of her Buckhead rose garden. Marcus had seen her. While she thought she was hiding in his shadow, playing the invisible perfect wife, he had been watching her with the reverence of a man looking at the sun. Every unguarded smile, every quiet moment of peace, he had captured and brought here, to this secret sanctuary. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, spilled over Eleanor's eyelashes. She sank onto the velvet sofa, covering her face with her hands, and let out a sob that seemed to carry the weight of 40 years. She cried for the man she had lost, the man she hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. She cried for the agonizing 30 days she had just survived, and she cried out of sheer, overwhelming gratitude. She was safe. After a long time, the tears subsided. Eleanor wiped her face, feeling a profound, profound lightness in her chest. She stood up and began to explore the rest of her kingdom. The kitchen was fully modernized, stocked with high-end appliances and gleaming copper pots. The upstairs held 4 spacious bedrooms, all boasting panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean. But it was the room at the end of the second-floor hallway that held the final piece of the puzzle. It was a study, modeled almost exactly after Marcus's study in Atlanta, but flooded with natural light from the turret windows. On the center of the massive oak desk sat a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Embossed in gold foil on the cover were 3 letters, EAV, Eleanor Ann Vance. She walked over to the desk, running her fingertips over the cool leather, and opened the cover. Inside, meticulously organized with tabs and perfectly typed summaries, was the architectural blueprint of her financial freedom. The first document was the original deed to 42 Ocean Park, dated June 1984, 3 months after their wedding. It was in her name alone. It was not a marital asset. It was a gift, legally isolated and completely insulated from the Vance estate. Behind the deed were the financial statements for a blind trust set up in Delaware. The trust held more than enough liquid capital to cover the property taxes, insurance, landscaping, and a local caretaker's salary for the next 50 years. Marcus had arranged for a local property management firm in Oak Bluffs to maintain the house, stock the pantry with non-perishables, and keep it ready for her arrival at a moment's notice. He had thought of absolutely everything. Eleanor turned to the last page in the portfolio. It was a handwritten note, penned in the same sharp script as the letter in the cigar box. "Welcome home, my queen. You spent 4 decades building a home for my children who did not deserve your grace. Now you have a home that deserves you. Rest now. The ocean air is good for the soul. But when you are ready, look inside the floor safe beneath the Persian rug. You will find the code is our anniversary." The estate in Atlanta was the illusion. What lies in that safe is the reality. Eleanor looked down at the beautiful, intricately woven Persian rug beneath her feet. The grief was gone, replaced by a sharp, electric thrill. Marcus had given her a sanctuary, yes. But Marcus was a warrior, and he knew that his children were scavengers. He wouldn't have just given her a shield. He would have given her a sword. Eleanor stepped off the rug and knelt on the mahogany floor, ready to see exactly what kind of reality her husband had left buried in the dark. 2 weeks after Eleanor's departure, the illusion of the Vance empire finally shattered. It began on a humid Tuesday morning at the Buckhead estate. Sienna Vance Carter stood on the expansive back lawn, dressed in designer activewear, a matcha latte in one hand and her phone in the other. She was ready to live stream the demolition of Eleanor's prized greenhouse to her 70,000 Instagram followers. A yellow Caterpillar bulldozer idled on the grass, its diesel engine rumbling. But the operator wasn't moving. He was arguing with a man in a cheap tan suit holding a clipboard. "Excuse me?" Sienna marched across the lawn, her sharp voice cutting through the noise. "What is the delay? I am paying your crew by the hour to tear this eyesore down." The man in the tan suit turned. He held up his hand, completely unfazed by her tone. "Sienna Vance Carter? I'm Inspector Higgins with the Atlanta Historical Preservation Society. I'm serving you with an immediate cease and desist order." Sienna scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Historical preservation? This is private property. My father built this house 30 years ago. It's not a historical landmark. Actually, ma'am, it is, Higgins said, handing her a thick stack of legal documents stamped with a red city seal. Marcus Vance petitioned the city and state boards 2 years ago to have the entire estate, including the gardens and the original glass structures, designated as a Class A protected historical site. It was approved and finalized just weeks before his passing. Sienna stared at the paperwork, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the paper. What does that mean? It means you cannot alter, demolish, or renovate any exterior structure, nor modify the primary interior architecture, without a 5-year review process from the board, Higgins recited smoothly. Furthermore, as the new owner, you are legally bound to maintain the property to its exact historical specifications. If you fail to do so, you face fines of up to $10,000 a day. And given the property's new tax bracket under this specific trust classification, your annual property taxes are estimated at $350,000, due by the end of the fiscal year. The matcha latte slipped from Sienna's hand, splashing across her white Balenciaga sneakers. She couldn't remodel it. She couldn't sell it without navigating a bureaucratic nightmare that would take years. And she owed $350,000 in taxes on a house she suddenly couldn't afford to keep. It wasn't a gift. It was an anchor, and it was tied directly to her neck. 10 miles away, in the sleek downtown offices of Vance Holdings, Desmond was experiencing his own specialized version of hell. He sat across from Arthur Sterling and a team of forensic accountants. Desmond was sweating through his custom Tom Ford shirt. His venture capital firm had just missed a massive margin call, and he desperately needed the liquid capital from his father's trust to stop the bleeding. Arthur, just authorized the wire transfer, Desmond snapped, slamming his hand on the glass table. I am the primary beneficiary. The money is mine. Release $10 million to my holding company by noon, or I'll have you disbarred. Arthur Sterling looked at Desmond with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. I cannot do that, Desmond, and neither can you. Did you actually read the stipulations of your trust, or did you stop at the dollar amount? Desmond's jaw tightened. It's a standard release. I'm of age. It is a performance-based restricted trust, Arthur corrected, sliding a highlighted document across the table. Marcus drafted a morality and fiscal responsibility clause. The trust funds are locked. They will only dispense annual dividends if, and only if, your personal business ventures maintain a verified, audited profit margin of 20% for 3 consecutive quarters. Desmond felt the blood drain from his face. The room spun. 20%? His firm was operating at a 5% deficit. They were practically insolvent. My father knew my margins, Desmond whispered, the terrifying realization washing over him. Yes, he did, Arthur said quietly. If you cannot meet at the 20% threshold, the trust remains frozen, generating interest for the Vance Foundation until you do. You are a multimillionaire on paper, Desmond, but in reality, you cannot access a single dime. Before Desmond could process the sheer, suffocating weight of his ruin, the conference room door burst open. Trey stumbled in, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He was shaking, his eyes darting frantically. Desmond, Des, I need a loan. Right now. Just $100,000 to float me. Desmond stood up, his own panic morphing into rage. Are you out of your mind? I don't have $100,000. Get it from your own trust. I can't, Trey shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. The auditor, the old man appointed a retired federal judge to oversee my discretionary fund. The guy just froze my accounts. He found the discrepancies. He found the money I took from the charity foundation last year. If I don't pay it back by Friday, he's turning the files over to the district attorney. I'm going to prison, Des. The 3 Vance men, and soon Sienna, who called Desmond screaming in tears about the bulldozers, were finally awake. The intoxicating high of the will reading had evaporated. Marcus Vance hadn't lost his mind. He had executed a masterpiece. He had given them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. Sienna was trapped in a financial black hole. Desmond was facing bankruptcy. Trey was facing a federal indictment. They were desperate, cornered animals, and cornered animals only look for one thing, a way out. Desmond gripped the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white. His mind raced, calculating, searching for a loophole. The vineyard, he breathed out, his eyes locking onto Arthur. Excuse me? Arthur asked, narrowing his eyes. "The house in Martha's Vineyard, the one he left to Eleanor," Desmond said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, predatory cadence. "Ocean Park real estate is worth millions. If my father bought that property while they were married, it's legally a marital asset. He undervalued it in the will by just giving her the key. We can contest it. We can force a sale and split the proceeds." Arthur shook his head firmly. "Desmond, do not go down this path. You have no idea what you are dealing with." "I'm dealing with my father's former secretary," Desmond snarled. "Call my litigators. We are going to Woods Hole. We are taking that house, and we are throwing that woman onto the street for real this time." While the Vance children were plunging into the abyss in Atlanta, Eleanor was discovering the exact depth of her husband's brilliance 1,000 miles away. The morning sun over Oak Bluffs was bright and clean. Eleanor had spent her first night in the sanctuary sleeping deeper than she had in 40 years. She woke up to the sound of seagulls and the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves. She brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea, wrapped herself in a thick cashmere shawl, and walked up the stairs to the sunlit study. She bypassed the beautiful mahogany desk and walked directly to the center of the room. She knelt on the wide plank floorboards and carefully rolled back the heavy Persian rug. There it was. Embedded flawlessly into the floor was a heavy, brushed steel combination safe. Marcus's note had been clear. "The code is our anniversary." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying her hands. June 14th, 1984. She reached down and gripped the cold metal dial. 0614884. She gripped the heavy steel handle and pulled upward. With a heavy, satisfying metallic thud, the locking mechanism disengaged. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. Eleanor peered into the dark cavity. There were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no gold bars or bearer bonds. Marcus knew that money was a temporary fix. Leverage was eternal. Inside the safe were 3 thick, black, leather-bound ledgers. Eleanor reached down and pulled them out, setting them on the floor beside her. They were heavy, smelling of aged paper and leather. Embossed in dull gold lettering on the spine of each ledger was a single name: Desmond, Sienna, Trey. She picked up Desmond's ledger first. As she opened the cover, she realized this wasn't just a diary. It was a fully weaponized legal dossier. Marcus had spent the last decade of his life quietly, meticulously investigating his own children. He had employed private investigators, forensic accountants, and corporate spies. Every page was filled with bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and photographs. Eleanor flipped through Desmond's file. It detailed with surgical precision the shell companies Desmond had created in the Cayman Islands to hide his venture capital losses. There were signed affidavits from former partners he had defrauded. It was enough evidence to not only bankrupt Desmond, but to send him to federal prison for securities fraud and tax evasion for 20 years. She opened Sienna's ledger next. The pristine, untouchable socialite's life was completely deconstructed. There were detailed logs of her crippling hidden credit card debt, bailed out anonymously by Marcus to save the family face. But worse, there were dates, times, and photographs documenting Sienna's multiple extramarital affairs with prominent Atlanta politicians, information that would instantly destroy her high society marriage and strip her of the prenuptial agreement she relied upon. Finally, she opened Trey's ledger. It was a tragic, infuriating catalog of theft. Marcus had tracked every single dollar Trey had skimmed from the Vance Foundation. He had copies of the forged signatures and the fake charitable invoices. Tucked into the very back of Trey's ledger was one final piece of thick cotton stationery. "My L, a king does not send his queen into the wilderness without her armor, and he certainly does not send her to war without a sword. I never used these files because, to my eternal shame, I was too weak to publicly destroy my own blood. I chose the coward's peace over justice. But you owe them no such loyalty. They have treated you with nothing but cruelty, arrogance, and contempt. They will realize the trap I have set for them. They will become desperate. And because they are predictable, they will come looking for your sanctuary to save themselves. When they arrive at your door, do not run. Do not hide. You hold their freedom, their reputations, and their futures in your hands. You are the executor of their fate. End them, Eleanor. With all my love, Marcus." Eleanor closed the ledgers, the heavy thwack of the leather covers echoing in the quiet study. She sat on the floor for a long time, the 3 black books resting in her lap. She looked out the window at the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The water was dark, deep, and impossibly powerful. For 40 years, Eleanor had believed her strength lay in her endurance. She had believed that being strong meant taking the hits, swallowing the insults, and maintaining her grace under fire. She had been the perfect, silent martyr, but as she ran her hand over the black leather spines of the ledgers, a new kind of strength bloomed in her chest. It was cold. It was absolute. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. Marcus had handed her the scythe. Eleanor stood up, leaving the safe open and carrying the ledgers to the mahogany desk. She stacked them neatly, one on top of the other. She walked out to the sweeping veranda, leaned against the intricate gingerbread railing, and took a deep, cleansing breath of the ocean air. Let them come. Let Desmond and Sienna and Trey bring their expensive lawyers and their desperate arrogance to her doorstep. She was ready. The sanctuary was secured, the weapons were loaded, and Eleanor Vance was finally ready to introduce her stepchildren to the woman she had always been beneath the veil. By the end of the 3rd week, the Vance siblings were no longer circling the drain. They were being violently pulled down into it. Desmond's venture capital firm had officially defaulted on 2 major loans. The news hadn't hit the Wall Street Journal yet, but the whispers in Atlanta's financial district were deafening. His credit lines were frozen, and the morality and fiscal responsibility clause in Marcus's trust meant Arthur Sterling wouldn't release a single penny to save him. Sienna was in a state of perpetual manic hysteria. The Historical Preservation Society had sent an inspector to her Buckhead estate every 3 days to ensure the grounds weren't being disturbed. The $350,000 property tax bill was looming, and the only way to pay it was to liquidate her offshore accounts, which she discovered to her horror were tied up in a 5-year maturation bond that Marcus had specifically selected. Trey was a ghost. He had barricaded himself in his luxury penthouse, refusing to answer the door. The retired federal judge overseeing his trust had given him until the end of the month to replace the embezzled funds before referring the matter to the Fulton County District Attorney. They were drowning in their inheritance. It was Desmond who finally broke the glass in case of an emergency. He summoned Sienna and Trey to his office on a Friday afternoon. He looked 10 years older, the bags under his eyes dark and heavy. "We are contesting the vineyard property," Desmond announced, his voice a ragged rasp. "I spoke to my litigators. If my father purchased that house during his marriage to Eleanor, we can argue it's a commingled marital asset. We can force an immediate injunction, mandate a sale, and split the liquid cash." Sienna scoffed, nervously twisting her diamond engagement ring. "Desmond, it's a house in Woods Hole or wherever. Father gave her a rusty key and a cigar box. It's probably a dilapidated fishing shack. What is a shack going to do for my tax bill?" "Martha's Vineyard real estate is platinum, Sienna," Desmond snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. "Even a 1/4 acre of dirt in Oak Bluffs is worth $2 million. If we force a sale, it buys us time. It buys us breathing room. We are flying to Massachusetts tomorrow." "We can't just show up," Trey mumbled, staring at the floor. "She hates us." "I don't care if she hates us," Desmond growled, his eyes feral. "She is a secretary who got lucky for 40 years. My father was clearly not in his right mind when he structured these trusts. We are going to that island. We are serving her with a notice of intent to sue, and we are taking that property. Get your bags." The private charter flight from Atlanta to Martha's Vineyard Airport was entirely silent. The heavy, suffocating anxiety radiating from the 3 siblings filled the cabin. Desmond had put the flight on one of his last operational corporate credit cards, a desperate gamble to project strength he no longer possessed. They landed on a brisk, brilliant Saturday afternoon. The island air was sharp and salty, a stark contrast to the thick, polluted heat of Atlanta. They rented a sleek black Cadillac Escalade, with Desmond aggressively taking the wheel. As they drove toward Oak Bluffs, the island revealed its quiet, historic wealth. There were no flashy, gaudy displays of new money. Instead, there were centuries-old stone walls, sprawling green properties, and a deep ingrained sense of legacy. For over 100 years, this specific enclave had been the ultimate summer sanctuary for the black elite, a place of immense cultural pride and fierce privacy. Sienna stared out the window, her lips curled in a slight sneer. "It's so quiet. Where are the country clubs?" "Focus, Sienna," Desmond muttered, gripping the steering wheel. The GPS on his phone glowed brightly. Destination approaching in 0.5 miles. 42 Ocean Park. Desmond turned the Escalade onto the sweeping curve of Ocean Park. The vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean opened up to their right, sparkling like crushed diamonds in the afternoon sun. To their left sat a crescent of magnificent historic Victorian homes. "All right," Desmond said, his jaw tight. "Look for number 42. It's probably the rundown one at the end of the row." The Escalade crawled along the road. Number 36, number 38, number 40. Desmond hit the brakes so hard that Trey was thrown forward against his seat belt. The heavy SUV shuddered to a halt in the middle of the street. Nobody spoke. The silence inside the Escalade was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. To their left, sitting proudly on a double lot with an unobstructed view of the ocean, was 42 Ocean Park. It was not a shack. It was not a dilapidated cottage. It was a breathtaking, multi-million-dollar Queen Anne Victorian masterpiece. The deep navy and crisp white paint gleamed in the sunlight. The manicured hydrangeas bloomed with violent, vibrant color. The architecture was flawless, exuding a kind of generational old-world wealth that made Sienna's Buckhead estate look like a tacky, mass-produced replica. "No," Desmond whispered, all the blood draining from his face. "No, that's impossible. He couldn't have." "Desmond," Sienna breathed, her voice trembling as she stared at the corner turret and the sweeping wraparound veranda. That house is worth $8 million. Easily. Maybe 10. Trey let out a hollow, manic laugh from the back seat. "A rusty key." He gave her a rusty key in a cigar box, and he gave her a palace. The sheer scale of their father's deception crashed over them like a tidal wave. Marcus hadn't exiled Eleanor. He had crowned her. He had secured the most valuable, untouchable, historically significant asset in his entire portfolio and hidden it in plain sight, ensuring his children would never lay a finger on it until it was safely in her hands. "Get out," Desmond said, his voice shaking with a dangerous mix of panic and fury. He threw the SUV into park and shoved his door open. "Get out of the car. We are serving her the papers. Now." They stepped out onto the crushed gravel driveway. Their expensive designer clothes, Desmond in his aggressive power suit, Sienna in her flashy Gucci, Trey in his wrinkled linen, suddenly looked entirely out of place against the dignified, stoic beauty of the historic estate. They looked like exactly what they were: desperate trespassers. As they walked up the brick pathway toward the grand wraparound porch, the heavy oak front door slowly swung open. Eleanor Vance stepped out into the sunlight. If they had expected to find a weeping, broken widow hiding in exile, the image before them shattered that delusion into a million jagged pieces. Eleanor was breathtaking. The heavy, suffocating mourning clothes of Atlanta were gone. She wore a flowing, wide-legged set of cream-colored raw silk that moved like water in the ocean breeze. Her hair was worn natural, a stunning crown of silver and charcoal framing her sharp, beautiful features. Around her neck rested a simple, heavy gold collar. She did not look surprised to see them. She did not look intimidated by Desmond's furious stride or Sienna's glaring eyes. She looked like an empress standing on the balcony of her own undisputed territory. In her hand, she held a delicate bone china teacup. Eleanor walked to the edge of the veranda and stopped, looking down at the three siblings standing on her brick pathway. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Earl Grey tea. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with 40 years of unspoken history. "You're early," Eleanor said. Her voice was smooth, dark, and perfectly level. It didn't waver. It didn't rise. It carried the chilling calm of a woman who held every single card in the deck. Desmond stopped at the base of the wooden porch stairs, looking up at her. He tried to summon the arrogant, barking authority he used to terrify his board of directors, but his chest was tight with panic. "Cut the act, Eleanor," Desmond snarled, pointing a finger up at her. "We know what this is. You and my father colluded to hide marital assets from the primary estate. This property is subject to probate review. I have a team of litigators in Atlanta drafting an injunction right now. You are going to sell this house, and the proceeds will be divided among the rightful heirs." Eleanor didn't blink. She lowered her teacup, her dark eyes locking onto Desmond's with a gaze so cold it made him take a subconscious half-step back. "Desmond," she said softly, "you are standing on my grass. You are speaking to me in a tone that I no longer have any obligation to tolerate. And you are bleeding to death in a tailored suit." Sienna gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "How dare you speak to him that way? You were nothing before our father married you. You are a glorified maid living in a stolen house." Eleanor slowly turned her gaze to Sienna. The younger woman withered under the intensity of the look, her bravado evaporating in an instant. "I suggest," Eleanor commanded, her voice slicing through the ocean breeze like a blade, "that you come up these stairs, sit in those chairs, and speak to me with the respect that you have owed me for 40 years. Because if you do not, Desmond, I will let you bankrupt yourself in court. Sienna, I will let the city seize your home. And Trey—" Eleanor's eyes flicked to the youngest brother, who was physically trembling at the back of the group. "I will let the federal judge send you to a very, very dark place." Desmond's mouth opened, but no words came out. The threat wasn't a bluff. The absolute terrifying certainty in Eleanor's voice told them that she knew. She knew about the frozen trusts. She knew about the debt. She knew everything. Eleanor turned her back on them with slow, deliberate grace, setting her teacup down on a wicker side table. She elegantly lowered herself into one of the plush, navy-cushioned rocking chairs facing the ocean. She crossed her legs, smoothing the cream silk over her knees. On the small table beside her, resting in the sunlight, were 3 thick, black, leather-bound ledgers. Eleanor rested her hands in her lap, looking out at the crashing waves. She didn't look back at them. She didn't need to. "Come up, children," Eleanor said into the salty air. "It is time for your inheritance." Slowly, as if walking to the gallows, Desmond, Sienna, and Trey climbed the wooden stairs of 42 Ocean Park. The illusion of their power was dead. The war was over, and the Queen was ready to hold court. The sweeping veranda of 42 Ocean Park was an architectural triumph designed for leisurely summer afternoons, the gentle clinking of iced tea glasses, and the soft murmur of polite conversation. But as Desmond, Sienna, and Trey Vance lowered themselves into the plush, navy-cushioned wicker chairs opposite Eleanor, the space felt as suffocatingly tense as an interrogation room. Eleanor remained seated in her rocking chair, the picture of absolute, terrifying serenity. The ocean breeze gently ruffled the collar of her cream silk blouse. She did not offer them tea. She did not ask about their flight. She simply let the silence stretch, heavy and unrelenting, allowing the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves to amplify their panic. Desmond was the first to crack. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and pulled a thick manila envelope from his leather briefcase. He tossed it onto the glass-topped wicker table separating them. It landed with a dull, pathetic thud next to Eleanor's bone china teacup. "Notice of intent," Desmond stated, though his voice lacked its usual booming boardroom authority. It sounded thin, reedy. "My litigators filed it in Fulton County this morning. It formally contests the exclusion of this property from the primary estate. We are requesting a freeze on all your assets, Eleanor, and a court-appointed appraiser for this house." Eleanor didn't even glance at the envelope. Her dark, obsidian eyes remained fixed on Desmond's face, studying the bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. "You spent your last line of credit on a private jet to hand me a piece of paper that holds absolutely no legal weight in the state of Massachusetts," Eleanor observed quietly. "Fulton County has no jurisdiction here, Desmond, and this house was deeded to me in June of 1984 as a separate non-marital gift. It is untouchable." "Everything is touchable if you throw enough lawyers at it," Desmond snarled, leaning forward trying to reclaim the physical space. "We will drag you through depositions until you are 75. We will bleed you dry with legal fees. You have no income, Eleanor. How long can you afford to fight us?" Eleanor finally smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the sharp, glinting edge of a guillotine blade. "I don't need to fight you, Desmond," she said softly. "You are already bleeding out. I simply need to decide whether to let you die quietly or whether to accelerate the process." She reached out and placed her manicured hand flat against the cover of the top black leather ledger resting on her side table. The dull gold letters on the spine faced the siblings. Trey. Trey, who had been staring blankly at the floorboards, snapped his head up. His bloodshot eyes widened as he recognized his father's custom, hand-bound leather stationery. "Let's begin with the youngest," Eleanor purred, flipping the heavy cover open. The thick parchment pages rustled in the sea breeze. "Trey Vance, discretionary trust beneficiary, board member of the Vance Philanthropic Foundation." She ran her finger down a meticulously typed column of numbers. $412,000. That is the exact amount you funneled from the Inner City Youth Athletic Fund into a shell vendor account in the span of 14 months. Forged invoices. Falsified signatures. Your father hired a forensic accountant 3 years ago. He tracked every single dime to your offshore sports betting accounts. Trey let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. He knew? He knew everything, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He appointed Judge Harrison to oversee your trust, not to guide you, Trey, but to trap you. You have exactly 6 days to replace that money before Harrison hands this exact file over to the district attorney. That's 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Eleanor, please, Trey begged, his bravado entirely shattered. Tears spilled over his cheeks. I didn't want to take it. I was in debt. Desmond wouldn't float me, and Sienna kept laughing at my car. I had to keep up appearances. Sienna shot out of her chair, her face flushed dark red with indignation. Do not drag me into your pathetic criminal incompetence, Trey. I have my own problems. She turned her furious gaze on Eleanor. This is blackmail. You forged those books. My father would never secretly investigate his own blood. Eleanor's eyes shifted to Sienna. With a calm, deliberate motion, she closed Trey's ledger, set it aside, and picked up the second black book. Sienna froze. The angry flush drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very fragile in her designer clothes. Sit down, Sienna, Eleanor commanded. It wasn't a request. Sienna slowly sank back into the wicker chair, her breathing shallow. Eleanor opened the book. Sienna Vance Carter, you inherited the crown jewel, the Buckhead estate, the liquid accounts, the offshore trust. A shame you can't touch a penny of the offshore money for 5 years due to the maturation clauses your father strictly enforced. Eleanor turned a page, her eyes scanning the text. And a shame about the Historical Preservation Society, a $350,000 tax bill, a house you cannot sell, cannot remodel, and cannot afford to maintain. How are you going to pay for it, Sienna? With the Black Centurion Amex that is currently $75,000 over limit? Sienna swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically toward Desmond for help, but Desmond was staring in sheer, unadulterated horror at the third book still sitting on the table. But the debt isn't the real tragedy, is it? Eleanor continued, her voice turning dangerously soft. She pulled a glossy 8x10 photograph from the back pocket of the ledger and placed it face up on the glass table next to Desmond's useless lawsuit. It was a crystal-clear, time-stamped photo of Sienna entering a boutique hotel in Midtown Atlanta, arm in arm with a very prominent, very married state senator. Sienna let out a choked whimper, slapping her hand over the photo to hide it. Your husband's prenuptial agreement has a very strict morality clause, doesn't it? Eleanor asked, tilting her head. Infidelity nullifies your alimony. If he sees this, if the press sees this, you will be divorced, destitute, and a social pariah before the ink dries on your Buckhead tax bill. You wouldn't, Sienna whispered, tears ruining her perfectly applied contouring. Eleanor, I am a mother. My reputation. You did not care about my reputation when you paraded your contractors through my home, Eleanor replied, her voice turning to ice. You did not care about my dignity when you laughed at my eviction. You are a parasite, Sienna. Your father knew it, and he insured against it. Eleanor closed Sienna's ledger. The sharp thwack of the leather echoed like a gunshot. She picked up the final, thickest book. Desmond. Desmond didn't move. The arrogant, barking alpha male who had strutted into the boardroom 30 days ago was gone. In his place was a hollow, terrified man, staring at the physical manifestation of his utter ruin. And finally, the heir apparent, Eleanor said, resting her hands on top of Desmond's ledger. She didn't even need to open it. She had memorized his sins. Vance Holdings. You told the board you were operating at a 20% profit margin. The truth is a 5% deficit. Your Cayman shell companies are hemorrhaging capital. You are insolvent. Desmond closed his eyes. A single drop of sweat dripped from his chin onto his expensive silk tie. Your father's morality and fiscal responsibility clause wasn't a challenge, Desmond, Eleanor explained, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. It was a quarantine. He knew you would sink the family empire, so he locked the primary capital away where your incompetence couldn't touch it. You are the CEO of a sinking ship, and the lifeboats are bolted to the deck. The ocean breeze blew across the veranda, chilling the sweat on Desmond's skin. He slowly opened his eyes, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of profound hatred and absolute defeat. "So what do you want?" Desmond asked, his voice hollow. "You have the gun to our heads. Pull the trigger. Send the files to the DA, the SEC, and the tabloids. Destroy the Vance name." Eleanor leaned back in her rocking chair, resting her chin on her fingertips. She looked at the 3 broken adults sitting before her. They were miserable, drowning in their own greed, suffocating under the weight of the traps they had blindly sprinted into. "My name is Vance," Eleanor said softly. "Yours is merely a liability." She leaned forward, her presence suddenly filling the entire space, radiating a terrifying absolute authority. "I am not your mother. I am not your savior. And as of today, I am no longer your victim," Eleanor declared. "Here are my terms of surrender. You will take that pathetic lawsuit off my table. You will return to Atlanta. You will deal with the federal judges, the tax collectors, and the margin calls on your own. You will scramble, and you will beg, and you will figure out how to survive the mess you created." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the stack of black ledgers. "If I ever see your faces on this island again, if I ever receive a letter from your attorneys, if you ever speak my name in public or private, I will not hesitate. I will overnight these ledgers to the authorities, and I will personally buy front row seats to watch your empires burn to ash." Eleanor picked up her teacup. "Do we have an understanding?" Trey was nodding frantically, his face buried in his hands. Sienna was sobbing quietly, staring at the floor, completely broken. Desmond looked at the black ledgers, then at the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate that he could never ever touch. He had been outplayed by his father from the grave, and checkmated by the woman he had spent 40 years underestimating. With shaking hands, Desmond reached out, picked up the manila envelope containing his lawsuit, and shoved it back into his briefcase. He stood up, his legs unsteady. "We understand," Desmond rasped. He didn't wait for his siblings. He turned and walked down the wooden stairs, his posture slumped, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Sienna followed silently, wiping her ruined makeup with a trembling hand. Trey practically ran after them, desperate to escape the suffocating gravity of the veranda. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, the ocean breeze catching her silver hair, and watched them retreat. She watched them climb back into the rented Escalade. She watched the heavy SUV turn around in the crushed gravel driveway and slowly drive away, disappearing down Ocean Park until it was nothing more than a speck in the distance. The silence returned to the sanctuary. It was no longer the heavy, dangerous silence of Atlanta. It was the vast, liberating silence of the sea. Eleanor Vance lifted her teacup, the fine bone china warm against her palms. She took a slow sip, tasting the bergamot, looking out over the endless, glittering expanse of the Atlantic. She had survived. She had conquered. And for the first time in 65 years, she was entirely, beautifully free. 6 months is a blink of an eye in the span of a 40-year marriage, but it is more than enough time for an empire built on arrogance to crumble into dust. By mid-February, the biting winter wind had stripped the trees bare in Atlanta, mirroring the desolate reality of the Vance siblings. Eleanor had never mailed the black leather ledgers to the authorities. She didn't have to. Marcus's brilliantly engineered trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing finality, leaving his children to suffocate under the weight of their own inheritance. Desmond's downfall was the loudest. The board of directors at Vance Holdings, realizing that the new CEO was completely locked out of the primary trust capital due to his catastrophic profit margins, staged a ruthless, bloodless coup. Without the millions he had planned to siphon from his father's accounts, Desmond's Cayman Island shell companies collapsed, triggering a cascade of defaults. He wasn't indicted. Eleanor had kept the ledger locked in her safe, honoring her promise. But he was professionally annihilated. The board forced his resignation on a dreary Tuesday morning. Now, Desmond Vance, the man who had poured $500 scotch in his father's study and mocked his stepmother, worked as a mid-level acquisitions consultant for a rival firm. He drove a leased mid-size sedan instead of a Porsche. He sat in a cubicle with glass half walls under harsh fluorescent lighting, taking orders from men a decade younger than him. Every time he looked at his meager paycheck, he remembered the staggering millions sitting in a trust he would never ever be disciplined enough to unlock. He was a king exiled to the mailroom of his own life. Sienna's ruin was quieter, but infinitely more humiliating. The Buckhead estate had become her personal, freezing purgatory. When the massive custom HVAC system failed in early January, Sienna discovered the cruelest caveat of the Historical Preservation Society. Any repairs had to be completed by specialized, board-approved contractors using historically accurate materials. The quote was $80,000. Sienna didn't have $8,000. Her offshore trust remained firmly locked behind its 5-year maturation wall. Her husband, horrified by the sudden avalanche of property taxes and maintenance fines, had placed a hard freeze on their joint accounts. To keep the city from placing a lien on the property, Sienna had been forced to quietly auction off her designer wardrobe. She spent her days bundled in thick cashmere sweaters inside the freezing, echoing mansion, taking photos of her Birkin bags and Cartier watches to sell on luxury consignment websites. The zero-edge infinity pool she had planned to build over Eleanor's rose garden was nothing but a dead patch of frozen mud. She was a prisoner in a museum she couldn't afford, terrified to answer her ringing phone, knowing it was either a debt collector or another historical inspector. And Trey? Trey was perhaps the only one who learned the lesson Marcus had intended, though the curriculum was brutal. Terrified by Eleanor's chilling promise, Trey had completely liquidated his life. He sold his penthouse, his watches, and his sports cars at a massive loss just to scrape together the $412,000 he had embezzled. He paid it back to the Vance Philanthropic Foundation via a cashier's check, handed directly to a very unamused Judge Harrison. To ensure Trey never touched another dime of the charity's money, the judge restructured his discretionary trust. Trey was now mandated to work an entry-level, 40-hour-a-week administrative job at the very youth athletic center he had stolen from. If he missed a single shift, the trust was permanently dissolved. He spent his days sorting donated basketball jerseys and mopping the gymnasium floor, jumping at every shadow, knowing how close he had come to a federal cell. Marcus Vance had given his children exactly what they asked for, and it had utterly destroyed them. 1,000 miles away, on the shores of Martha's Vineyard, the brutal New England winter was beginning to yield to the crisp, promising thaw of early spring. For Eleanor, the last 6 months had not been a period of mourning, but an intense, beautiful process of molting. When she first arrived at 42 Ocean Park, she had been a woman tightly wound in the armor of a society wife, hypervigilant, carefully composed, constantly anticipating the next attack. But as the weeks bled into months, the island began to work its profound, healing magic on her. The heavy, suffocating anxiety she had carried in Atlanta simply evaporated in the salty ocean air. She stopped wearing the restrictive, tailored St. John knits and the heavy pearls. Instead, she embraced the elegant, effortless coastal luxury of Oak Bluffs. Thick, cream-colored fisherman sweaters, soft cashmere joggers, and long, flowing coats. She let her hair grow out naturally, a stunning, regal crown of silver and charcoal that she no longer bothered to dye black for the sake of Atlanta's society photographers. She also discovered that she was not alone. Oak Bluffs was a tight-knit, fiercely protective community of affluent Black Americans who understood the exact kind of life Eleanor had survived. She didn't have to explain herself here. By November, she had been invited into a local literary circle that met in the historic cottages of the Camp Meeting Association. By January, she was serving on the board of the local historical society, a delicious irony she chuckled at whenever she thought of Sienna. Most importantly, Eleanor had joined the Polar Bears, the legendary group of Black swimmers who gathered at Inkwell Beach every morning. Every day at dawn, regardless of the chill in the air, Eleanor walked across Ocean Park, her bare feet sinking into the freezing, wet sand. She waded into the icy Atlantic alongside doctors, retired judges, and artists, letting the freezing water shock her system, washing away the last lingering ghosts of the Vance Empire. When she emerged from the water, shivering and laughing with women who genuinely loved her company, she felt more alive at 65 than she had at 30. The sanctuary at 42 Ocean Park had evolved too. It was no longer just a shrine to Marcus's secret devotion. Eleanor had slowly, respectfully integrated her own present into the space. She kept the beautiful photographs he had framed, but she added new ones. Polaroids of her new friends on the beach, a painting she had purchased from a local artist in Edgartown, and vases filled with wild beach plums she had picked herself. The 3 black leather ledgers were securely locked inside the floor safe beneath the Persian rug. Eleanor hadn't looked at them since the day Desmond, Sienna, and Trey had fled her porch. They were relics of a war that was over. She didn't need to check on her stepchildren to know they were suffering. The absence of their lawyers was proof enough. One brisk Tuesday morning in early March, Eleanor sat at the massive oak desk in the turret study. The sunlight streamed through the leaded glass, casting a warm golden glow across the mahogany floor. She had just finished a phone call with Arthur Sterling. Arthur had formally resigned from Vance Holdings after Desmond's ousting, deeply disgusted by the ruins of his best friend's legacy. He had called simply to check on Eleanor, a quiet olive branch from her old life. "They are broken, Eleanor," Arthur had told her, his voice heavy with a mix of sorrow and vindication. Marcus's trusts operated with surgical precision. They have no capital, no leverage, and no power. You are entirely safe. "I know, Arthur," Eleanor had replied smoothly. "I have known since I turned the key." Now Eleanor opened the thick leather portfolio that held her own trust documents. Marcus had funded the blind trust with enough liquid capital to cover the estate's taxes and maintenance for 50 years. But looking closely at the quarterly statements from the Delaware management firm, Eleanor noticed a staggering surplus. Marcus hadn't just left her maintenance money. The trust generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in passive dividend income every single year. It was a massive, overflowing reservoir of wealth that was sitting idle, compounding quietly in the dark. Eleanor leaned back in the heavy leather chair, looking out the turret window at the vast, endless ocean. Marcus had spent 40 years building a corporate empire that had ultimately produced nothing but greed, betrayal, and 3 hollow, miserable children. He had spent his life accumulating wealth for people who despised him, only finding true peace in the secret shadows of this house. "I loved you in the shadows, Eleanor. Now step into the light," his letter had read. Eleanor's dark eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of brilliant, transformative inspiration igniting in her chest. She was 65 years old. She was independently wealthy, entirely free of the Vance family's toxic gravity, and living in one of the most historically significant Black communities in the country. She was not going to spend the next 20 years simply sitting on her veranda, drinking Earl Grey tea, and fading quietly into the coastal fog. If Desmond, Sienna, and Trey were the ashes of Marcus's legacy, then she was going to be the rebirth. She pulled a fresh piece of heavy cream-colored stationery from the desk drawer. She picked up a silver fountain pen, unscrewed the cap, and began to write. She wasn't writing a will, and she certainly wasn't writing a trap. Eleanor Vance was going to build an empire of her own, and this one would be entirely, brilliantly bulletproof. The Oak Bluffs Historical Commission met on the first Tuesday of every month in the basement of the town hall. It was usually a quiet, bureaucratic affair, involving paint swatches, zoning disputes, and polite disagreements over the acceptable width of cedar shingles. But on a rainy Tuesday in April, the atmosphere in the room crackled with a distinct electric energy. Eleanor Vance stood at the head of the long conference table. She wore a tailored emerald green silk blouse tucked into wide-leg ivory trousers, a striking visual contrast to the muted tweeds and practical raincoats of the board members. She had brought with her a team of the island's most respected preservation architects and a stack of beautifully bound, heavily detailed proposals. "I am proposing the outright purchase and complete historic restoration of the old Narragansett Inn," Eleanor stated, her voice projecting with the smooth, undeniable authority of a woman who was entirely comfortable with her power. The board members exchanged wide-eyed glances. The Narragansett Inn was a sprawling 3-story Victorian structure 2 streets over from Ocean Park. Once a bustling, joyous hub for Black intellectuals and artists in the 1920s, it had sat abandoned for over a decade, slowly rotting from the salt air and neglect. It was a beloved but massive eyesore, and every developer who had looked at it had walked away, terrified by the exorbitant costs of historically accurate restoration. Dr. Eris Thorne, the silver-haired chairman of the commission, adjusted his spectacles. "Eleanor, we are thrilled by your interest, but the structural damage to the foundation alone, we are talking about millions of dollars before you even hang a piece of drywall, and the Society's restrictions on the facade are absolute." "I am well aware of the restrictions, Dr. Thorne," Eleanor smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her dark eyes. "In fact, I am counting on them. I do not want to change a single piece of the gingerbread trim. I want to hire local artisans to recreate the original 1924 architectural blueprints down to the brass door hinges. The capital is already secured in a blind trust, and the escrow account is fully funded." She slid the financial viability documents across the table. But it is the purpose of the restoration that I want you to consider, Eleanor continued, leaning slightly forward, her tone softening into something deeply passionate. I do not want to turn it into a boutique hotel or luxury condos for summer tourists. I am establishing the Vanguard House. The room fell completely silent, listening raptly. For 40 years, I existed in a world where women, particularly women of a certain age and background, were expected to be the silent scaffolding that held up powerful men. When those men leave, or when the families decide the scaffolding is no longer aesthetically pleasing, those women are discarded. Eleanor's voice was steady, devoid of bitterness, but ringing with profound truth. I survived my displacement because I was given a sanctuary. I want to build one for those who weren't. She gestured to the architectural renderings. The Vanguard House will be a fully funded retreat and resource center for older women navigating sudden, catastrophic life transitions. Widowhood, severe financial disenfranchisement, disinheritance. We will provide temporary, dignified housing in a historic setting. We will have top-tier financial advisors and litigators on retainer to help them untangle their assets. But most importantly, we will give them a community where they can remember who they were before the world told them their usefulness had expired. Dr. Thorne stared at the proposal, deeply moved. He looked up at Eleanor, seeing the formidable, brilliant matriarch she had fully become. Eleanor, Dr. Thorne said softly, his voice thick with emotion. It is the most ambitious, honorable project this board has seen in 30 years. You have our unanimous approval. While Eleanor was laying the foundation for a legacy of empowerment in Massachusetts, the ghosts of Atlanta made one final, desperate attempt to drag her back into the ashes. 2 weeks after the commission meeting, Eleanor was sitting on the veranda of 42 Ocean Park, enjoying the warming spring breeze. On the wicker table beside her sat a stack of mail forwarded from Arthur Sterling's office. Among the glossy catalogs and polite society invitations, there was a thick, crinkled envelope bearing the return address of a cheap, short-term apartment complex in downtown Atlanta. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. It was Desmond's. Eleanor picked up the envelope. 6 months ago, the sight of Desmond's handwriting would have spiked her adrenaline and triggered a trauma response. Now she felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just a mild, clinical curiosity. She sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a 3-page letter, typed but signed in frantic, heavy ink. Desmond was begging. The aggressive, barking CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a broken man drowning in the consequences of his own arrogance. He wrote about his ousting from Vance Holdings. He wrote about the agonizing reality of the frozen trusts, the margin calls that had bankrupted him, and the humiliation of his new entry-level corporate existence. But the core of the letter was a plea for a bridge loan. Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask. I know what we did to you in those 30 days. I was blinded by the empire, and my father used my own greed to destroy me. I am facing personal bankruptcy. They are foreclosing on my remaining assets next week. You have the vineyard property. You have equity, just $500,000 against the house. I will pay you back with interest the moment my trust unlocks. Please, I am your husband's flesh and blood. Eleanor read the letter twice, the ocean breeze ruffling the pages. I am your husband's flesh and blood. It was the ultimate manipulation, the exact kind of emotional blackmail Marcus had yielded to for his entire life. Marcus had bought their silence, funded their mistakes, and sacrificed his own peace, and Eleanor's dignity, to protect his flesh and blood. Eleanor placed the letter on the glass table. She looked at the sprawling, magnificent Victorian estate she now called home, paid for by the surplus funds of a man who had loved her, but who had been too cowardly to defend her while he lived. She wasn't Marcus. She did not share his guilt, and she certainly did not share his blood. Eleanor stood up, picked up the letter, and walked inside to the study. She didn't write a scathing reply. She didn't call Desmond to mock his downfall or gloat about her victory. She simply fed the 3 pages, one by one, into the heavy-duty paper shredder beside her oak desk. With a mechanical whir, the last desperate remnants of the Vance children were sliced into illegible ribbons of confetti. She picked up her phone and dialed Arthur Sterling. "Arthur?" Eleanor said cheerfully when the lawyer answered. "How is the weather in Atlanta?" "Humid, Eleanor. The humidity is already unbearable," Arthur chuckled. "How is the island?" "Beautiful. We are breaking ground on the Narragansett property next week. I'm calling with a small administrative request, Eleanor said smoothly. Please instruct your mailroom to cease forwarding any correspondence from Desmond, Sienna, or Trey Vance. In fact, mark any future communications from them as return to sender, deceased. Arthur paused on the other end of the line, the weight of her instructions settling in. Then a low, approving hum vibrated through the speaker. Understood, Eleanor. Consider them permanently redirected. Have a wonderful summer. Eleanor hung up the phone. The severance was absolute. The cord was cut. The past was dead, shredded, and thrown away. By mid-June, Martha's Vineyard had exploded into a vibrant, brilliant summer. The island was alive with the hum of fairies, the blooming of hydrangeas, and the arrival of the summer residents. But the center of attention in Oak Bluffs was not the beaches. It was the massive restoration project on Narragansett Avenue. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk outside the old inn, wearing a crisp white linen suit and a bright yellow hard hat. Behind her, a team of local contractors was carefully, painstakingly restoring the sweeping Victorian porch. The rotted wood had been stripped away, replaced by fresh, historically sourced cedar that smelled sharp and clean in the morning air. Beside her stood Dr. Thorne and several women from her morning swimming group, the Polar Bears. They were drinking iced coffee, watching the transformation of the historic building with awe. "You know, Eleanor," Dr. Thorne said, adjusting his glasses against the bright sun, "when you first pitched this, I thought it was a beautiful dream. But seeing the scaffolding go up, seeing the life return to this corner, you are building something that is going to outlast all of us." Eleanor looked up at the intricate woodwork being installed above the main entrance. The contractors were currently carving the large wooden placard that would hang above the double doors. The Vanguard House, established 2026. She thought of the cold, sterile boardroom in Atlanta. She thought of the 30 days she had spent packing her life into 3 Louis Vuitton trunks, swallowing her tears while Sienna tore up her rose garden. She thought of the rusted iron key in the cheap cedar cigar box. They had tried to bury her. They had tried to erase 40 years of devotion with an attorney's signature and a mocking laugh. But they had not realized that Eleanor Vance was not a woman who could be paved over. She was a seed. And when they threw her into the dark, she simply took root. "It isn't a dream, Eris," Eleanor said softly, a profound, unshakable peace radiating from her dark eyes. "It's a foundation." The contractors shouted over the noise of the power tools, laughing as they hoisted a massive beam into place. The sound of construction wasn't destructive like the bulldozers in Atlanta. It was the sound of creation. It was the sound of a woman who had taken the ashes of a stolen life and built an empire that no one, not a greedy stepchild, not a cowardly husband, and not a society of whispers, could ever take away. The Vanguard House was rising, and Eleanor Vance, the Queen of Ocean Park, was finally exactly where she belonged.